For generations, the Whittaker home in Odd, West Virginia had functioned as a world of its own, isolated, weather-beaten, and defined more by habit than structure. What outsiders saw as unusual or even shocking was, to the family inside, simply familiar. But state officials don't evaluate familiarity. They evaluate risk, vulnerability, and the presence, or absence, of consistent protection. When Adult Protective Services removed Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray from that hillside home, the public demanded explanations. How could the state justify taking 3 adults who had lived there all their lives? How could decades of routine be uprooted so abruptly? The deeper investigators and caseworkers looked, the more they found a pattern not of malicious intent, but of overwhelming circumstances, blurred boundaries, and conditions that gradually slipped beyond anyone's control. The decision wasn't made because of a single moment. It was made because a long chain of concerns finally converged. The first concern, and perhaps the most overlooked, was the sheer level of vulnerability inside that household. Timmy, in his mid-40s, carried the developmental profile of someone who navigated the world as a much younger person. Ray, with advancing age and limited communication, depended almost entirely on others to interpret his needs. Lorraine, nearing 80, struggled with her own limitations while simultaneously attempting to assist those around her. None of the 3 could reliably evaluate danger, manage conflict, or seek help without guidance. Their well-being depended not just on love, but on consistent stability, and that's precisely where the situation grew complicated. Larry and Betty had carried the weight of responsibility for decades. No one denied their commitment. No one denied their loyalty. But commitment is not the same as capacity, and over time, capacity became the question social workers could no longer ignore. Both caregivers were aging. Both faced health issues of their own. Both were emotionally exhausted after years of trying to protect their relatives from everything the world threw at them: poverty, trespassers, illness, and the mounting public attention that descended after viral videos made the family internationally recognized. That public attention became its own threat. Once the first documentaries circulated online, the Whittakers' home stopped being private. Cars pulled over on the road. Strangers filmed from the fence line. Some walked straight into the yard without hesitating, drawn by curiosity rather than respect. Crowds treated the family as folklore rather than human beings whose boundaries deserved honoring. That pressure pushed Larry and Betty into defensive mode, often unsure of who could be trusted, overwhelmed by the constant ringing of phones, pounding on doors, and strangers making demands for just a quick picture. The intrusion was never-ending. And in that chaos, the needs of the 3 most vulnerable adults became harder to track, harder to prioritize, and harder to manage. State officials took note. The house itself carried another set of warnings. Multiple reports described structural deterioration, rotting boards, cluttered walkways, inconsistent access to running water, makeshift heating arrangements, and areas contaminated by age, disrepair, or lack of resources. None of these conditions were the result of neglectful intentions. Poverty leaves its mark even on the most devoted families. But when you combine complex disabilities, elderly caregivers, and an environment that had slowly deteriorated over decades, social workers saw the kind of cumulative risk that cannot be dismissed. Aging structures don't adjust themselves for disabled residents. They don't light a safer path, reinforce weak flooring, or ensure warm water flows reliably. They wait for someone else to fix them, and Larry and Betty, despite their best efforts, no longer had the means or the strength to make those improvements on their own. Another concern emerged as investigators reviewed the household's history with outside influences. Over time, various acquaintances and visitors had been welcomed into the home, sometimes because the family trusted easily, sometimes because turning people away felt difficult or dangerous, depending on the situation. Not all visitors were disruptive, but enough incidents accumulated to raise alarms. Reports referenced fights, conflicts, and moments where people with unstable tempers or questionable intentions were allowed too close to individuals who couldn't defend themselves. This wasn't a matter of blame, it was a matter of vulnerability. State agencies look at patterns. They look at frequency, not popularity. They look at whether a family's environment consistently protects those who cannot protect themselves. And as these interactions added up, the state saw a concerning pattern: a home with too many outside pressures, too few safeguards, and too many moments where overwhelmed caregivers struggled to maintain control. Then came the issue of finances. No one missed the fact that donations tied to the Whittaker name exceeded 6 figures. Money came from sympathetic viewers, from fundraising campaigns, from people who watched videos and believed the contributions would create better living conditions. Yet the home itself showed little structural change. Outsiders debated where the money went, who managed it, who benefited, and why improvements seemed so minimal. The family itself struggled to account for every dollar, understandably, given the lack of formal management or financial oversight. But from the perspective of state officials, the lack of documentation mattered. Vulnerable adults require accountability. When funds intended for their welfare move through informal channels without records, confusion becomes risk. And risk becomes intervention. The state can't assume mismanagement, but it also can't ignore the absence of clarity. Overlaying all of this was the deterioration of internal family dynamics. Stress changes people. Pressure distorts communication. Over the months leading to the intervention, long-time relationships grew strained. Arguments became more frequent. Decisions about who could be trusted, who should visit. The removal of Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray wasn't a punishment. It wasn't an attack on the Whittakers. It was the endpoint of a long sequence of events that created a situation where the state no longer felt confident that the home, as it currently operated, could protect the needs of 3 adults with profound vulnerabilities. The decision, painful as it was, reflected the kind of calculation child welfare agencies make all the time. But this time, it was applied to adults whose disabilities required the same level of protection children receive. State care does not fix everything. It does not erase trauma or undo decades of routine. But it does provide systems that private households cannot replicate. Medical oversight, documentation requirements, restricted access for visitors, environmental monitoring, clean living conditions, regulated finances, and trained professionals on duty around the clock. Whether the public agreed or not, the state's determination rested on one central question. Are the most vulnerable people in this household safer staying where they are, or safer somewhere monitored, structured, and protected? For the first time in their lives, Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were offered an environment where supervision was consistent, dangers were filtered, and every decision affecting them had to be checked and recorded. It was not a judgment on Larry and Betty's love. It was recognition that love alone had reached its limit. As this investigation continues, deeper layers will unfold: financial, emotional, and social factors that shaped the final decision. But every piece of evidence points to the same truth. The situation became bigger than the 2 people trying to manage it. And the state intervened not because it didn't care, but because caring required more than the family had left to give. Comment below. What do you think was the number 1 factor that tipped the scales for the state? Once the initial assessment was completed, state investigators began assembling the broader picture, one built not on rumor, but on patterns repeated over years. Their focus wasn't on moments caught on camera or clips shared online. It was on the systems surrounding the family, the overlapping pressures, and the vulnerabilities that kept escalating without intervention. What they found confirmed that the situation in Odd wasn't a single-issue problem. It was a multi-layered crisis that had been silently developing for decades. The most striking piece of the puzzle centered on the slow collapse of the caregiving structure inside the home. In private conversations documented by caseworkers, Betty acknowledged her exhaustion. She admitted her memory wasn't as sharp as it once had been. She discussed her own medical appointments, her chronic stress, and the emotional toll of trying to manage everyone's needs. Larry, likewise, expressed frustration with the pressure placed on him, frustration with outside influences, and frustration with the public attention that had reshaped their quiet lives into something chaotic. But neither Betty nor Larry realized how closely the state was watching these moments. To investigators, every expression of exhaustion added to the evidence that the caregiving system had become unsustainable. In situations involving vulnerable adults, the state looks for signs that caregivers are reaching their limit. Fatigue doesn't have to be intentional neglect. It can simply mean too much responsibility on too few shoulders. And the pressures weren't just emotional or physical. Financial strain played a much larger role than many outsiders understood. For a household with 5 adults, 3 of them disabled and fully dependent, expenses stack quickly. Medical visits, medications, transportation, food, hygiene products, utilities, repairs, emergencies. Even small disruptions can destabilize a system already teetering on the edge. The family had never lived with abundance. They had survived, often barely, on whatever came their way. Yet despite public donations totaling over $100,000, the environment did not significantly improve. The home remained deteriorated. The yard remained cluttered. The structural issues remained unresolved. To the state, this raised a critical question. Was the household capable of managing funds in a way that consistently benefited the vulnerable adults? No one suggested wrongdoing, but officials did question whether the family had the skills, oversight, or capacity to manage large sums responsibly. When a disabled person's welfare depends on financial competence, any uncertainty becomes a valid concern. This led to another complication: outside influences. Over the course of 2024 and 2025, various YouTubers, creators, filmmakers, and self-styled advocates appeared at the property. Some brought genuine help, others brought cameras and chaos. The flow of visitors increased unpredictably. Some encouraged the family to make decisions they didn't fully understand. Some pushed narratives for their own content needs. Some fueled conflict, intentionally or not, between family members whose relationships were already fragile. Investigators highlighted this as a major risk factor. When strangers cycle in and out of a home filled with vulnerable adults, boundaries blur. The lines between emotional dependency and manipulation blur. The difference between support and exploitation becomes impossible for the disabled individuals to distinguish. In several reports, the family found themselves caught between competing voices, each person claiming to know what was best for them. This instability made the state question whether the home could protect the vulnerable adults from outside pressure. With viral fame came power imbalances, and those imbalances created new dangers. The family couldn't control who showed up. They couldn't control the motives behind visitors' offers. And they couldn't shield Timmy, Lorraine, or Ray from becoming pawns in larger online conflicts. It was within this context that another critical concern emerged: the inconsistent handling of threats from individuals known to cause harm. Though the details varied depending on the source, there were repeated reports of aggressive behavior directed toward the vulnerable adults by a couple who had, at times, been allowed access to the home. Incidents involving physical altercations, shouting, or intimidation were described by multiple witnesses. Each time such individuals re-entered the home or remained nearby, the state noted it as a failure of boundary enforcement, not because Larry and Betty didn't care, but because they couldn't maintain control over their environment. Caregiving is not only about providing food or shelter. It is also about creating a safe perimeter around those who cannot create one for themselves. The state ultimately concluded that this perimeter didn't exist in Odd. Too many people crossed too many lines with too little resistance, leaving the vulnerable adults exposed. Another layer involved the environment inside the home itself. Caseworkers observed cluttered spaces that posed mobility risks, sanitation concerns in the kitchen, and structural issues that went unresolved for years. These were not failures of morality. They were failures of capacity. Elderly caregivers with limited resources can only do so much, and over time, small problems compound: loose floorboards, clutter near exits, unstable furniture, heating inconsistencies, broken appliances, and poor ventilation. Each small hazard by itself might be manageable, but when compounded, they form a picture of chronic instability. The most vulnerable individuals in the home were aging too. Lorraine, nearing 80, required increasing physical support. Ray's conditions made it difficult for him to navigate clutter safely. Timmy's tendency toward confusion heightened the risk of accidents. A single fall could lead to hospitalization. A single infection could spiral into crisis. And unlike nursing facilities, where incidents are documented and addressed systematically, home settings rely entirely on the caregiver's capacity to notice and act. The state determined that the risk of undetected medical issues was too high. Then there was the matter of communication. Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray struggled to verbalize discomfort, fear, or pain. This alone dramatically increases risk in home settings. When individuals cannot report abuse, cannot articulate symptoms, and cannot describe what happened in a given situation, investigators must rely entirely on external signs, and those signs can be subtle or easily missed in a busy or stressed household. In institutional care, staff members are required to document everything: skin checks, medication administration, behavioral changes, hygiene routines, and incidents of distress. At home, this level of monitoring is nearly impossible for two elderly individuals to maintain around the clock. As investigators reviewed the totality of circumstances, they began to recognize that Larry and Betty were not intentionally failing their family, they were drowning under the weight of responsibilities far beyond their capacity. The final and most decisive factor was something both caregivers unintentionally demonstrated in interviews: the reluctance to set firm boundaries for the sake of safety. Whether from habit, fear of conflict, or emotional loyalty, they repeatedly allowed individuals with histories of volatility or exploitation back into the orbit of the household. Even when they recognized danger, they struggled to act decisively. The state cannot base a safety plan on hope. After weeks of interviews, home visits, environmental assessments, and medical evaluations, the findings converged. Each factor, alone, might not have triggered removal. But together, they created an environment the state considered unsustainable. Overstretched caregivers, deteriorating living conditions, financial confusion, frequent outside intrusion, inconsistent boundary enforcement, medical vulnerability, communication limitations. The state didn't intervene because it wanted to. It intervened because every system that should have provided support had collapsed under pressure. In Part 3, the focus shifts to what happened after removal, how the trio responded, what protections were put in place, and why state care, despite its imperfections, offered advantages the Odd home simply could not. Comment below. Do you think the state focused more on the living conditions or the outside influences when making their decision? When the state removed Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray from the home, it did not happen quietly. The separation was emotional, confusing, and painful, especially for a family that had weathered decades of hardship together. But the story did not end with the state car driving away from the dirt driveway in Odd, West Virginia. In many ways, that was only the beginning. The first 48 hours after removal were critical. The trio was taken to a temporary assessment facility where medical staff, social workers, and psychologists began evaluating their needs. For individuals with limited communication abilities, these assessments required careful observation. Every gesture, every response to sensory stimuli, every reaction to unfamiliar environments had to be interpreted. Contrary to online theories that removal was chaotic or traumatizing, case notes painted a more nuanced picture. Timmy, who often reacts strongly to change, initially exhibited confusion and anxiety, pacing, muttering, searching for familiar objects. But once staff introduced structured routines, predictable mealtimes, and calming sensory activities, his behavior stabilized more quickly than expected. Several evaluators noted that he responded positively to consistency, something increasingly difficult to maintain in the unpredictable setting he had come from. Lorraine, despite her age and frailty, showed signs of relief. Staff observed her settling into clean bedding, accepting warm meals, and responding to gentle conversation. She smiled, nodded, and even asked simple questions about her new surroundings, questions she had not asked in years, according to relatives. Ray required the closest monitoring. His nonverbal communication made assessments challenging, but nurses noticed clear patterns. When provided with quiet spaces, warm blankets, and steady routines, he relaxed his posture. His facial tension eased. His breathing slowed. For the first time in a very long time, there were no sudden visitors, no unexpected voices shouting in the yard, no conflicts happening on the other side of a thin wall. This quiet was not just comforting, it was therapeutic. After several days of evaluation, the trio was transitioned into long-term care placements. Each placement was tailored to their specific physical, emotional, and cognitive needs. Unlike their home environment, where one caregiver's bad day could ripple through the entire household, state care provided a team, nurses, specialists, aides, and administrators all working under regulated systems. One of the most significant changes was daily documentation. At home, no one monitored hydration levels, bowel movements, sleep patterns, medication timing, or bruising patterns with medical precision. In care facilities, these became part of a written record reviewed every shift. If Timmy didn't sleep well one night, the next shift knew. If Lorraine showed signs of soreness, treatment began immediately. If Ray's appetite changed, dietary staff reassessed his meal plan. This continuous observation created a safety net the home had never been able to provide. Specialists also began mapping out the trio's long-term care needs. Timmy's tendencies toward overstimulation required structured activities. Lorraine's mobility issues raised fall risk concerns. Ray's communication limitations required tailored behavior plans. Each of these needs had existed for decades, but only now did professionals have the tools and authority to address them systematically. Then came the legal process. Because none of the three could advocate for themselves, the state appointed guardians ad litem, legal representatives whose sole responsibility was to protect their interests. These guardians reviewed medical records, interviewed staff, spoke with relatives, and analyzed environmental reports from the home. The results aligned with the investigators' initial findings. Returning the trio to the old environment would place them back into the same cycle of instability and risk. But the legal system also recognized the emotional reality. For all their limitations, the trio had deep attachments to Larry and Betty. State care offered safety, but not family bonds. To address this conflict, supervised visitation plans were proposed. These visits allowed limited contact in controlled environments where staff could ensure safety while preserving emotional connection. In early visits, staff documented a noticeable shift. While Timmy had once been agitated and unpredictable during interactions at the home, he appeared calmer in supervised settings. Lorraine engaged more. Ray maintained steady eye contact. The structured environment made the interactions healthier, more peaceful, and less chaotic than what relatives described happening at the home. But even with supervised visits, the state faced pressure from the public, from online creators, and from people who misunderstood the complexity of the case. Many believed the trio belonged with their family no matter what. Others insisted the state had overstepped. What these arguments missed was the fundamental issue: safety cannot depend on good intentions alone. The most revealing moment in the case came during a multidisciplinary review meeting where medical professionals, behavioral experts, social workers, and legal representatives compared notes. Each field had reached the same conclusion independently. For Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray, deterioration had been happening slowly, physically, mentally, and emotionally, long before the cameras arrived, long before outside creators turned their lives into content. While love existed, stability did not. And with every new intrusion, every new conflict, every new stranger arguing over their fate online, the instability deepened. In one section of the report, a behavioral specialist described the trio's previous environment as emotionally volatile and excessively porous. The term porous referred to the way boundaries dissolved, strangers entering the home, acquaintances influencing decisions, and external drama infiltrating daily life. The trio was living in a space where they had no control over who appeared, what was said, or what decisions were made about them. In contrast, their new environment offered predictability. Wake up at the same time. Meals at the same time. Activities at the same time. Medications checked twice. Staff shifts documented. Every bruise logged. Every behavior change recorded. Predictability is not a luxury for vulnerable adults. It is survival. As weeks turned into months, caseworkers documented significant improvements. Timmy's agitation spells reduced in frequency. Lorraine gained weight after long periods of inconsistent eating at home. Ray's hygiene improved once he received regular baths with staff assistance. None of these improvements suggested that Larry or Betty didn't love them. Instead, they suggested that love alone was no longer enough to meet the demands of their care. The most difficult realization for the family came when the state presented its long-term safety plan. Based on comprehensive evaluations, they recommended that the trio remain in professional care indefinitely. The recommendation was not meant to punish the family, nor to erase decades of caregiving. It was simply the safest option in a situation where risk could not be reduced any other way. This announcement triggered strong emotions: confusion from the trio, heartbreak from the relatives, and anger from parts of the online community. But the decision was grounded in one undeniable truth: the home had become too unpredictable, too vulnerable, and too burdened to ensure safety for those who could not protect themselves. The next phase of the story became about adjustment. The trio learned new routines. They gained access to recreational programs, gentle walks, music therapy, sensory calming sessions, and structured social opportunities. For the first time, professionals evaluated their cognitive abilities with tools designed specifically for adults with developmental disabilities. These evaluations revealed that their abilities were far more nuanced than outsiders realized. Each had strengths that had gone unrecognized due to the chaotic nature of their home environment. Staff also began preparing for long-term medical planning, tracking mobility decline, cognitive changes, and age-related issues. In a home setting, these declines might have gone unnoticed until crisis. In care, they became predictable events with strategies in place. Meanwhile, Larry and Betty faced their own challenges. Their home felt emptier. Their routines changed. Their roles shifted from caregivers to visitors. And with that shift came a profound sense of loss. Yet the state continued to allow supervised visitation, acknowledging the emotional bond that existed. As long as visits remained calm, respectful, and safe, the state supported them. This compromise, safety in care, connection in supervision, became the balance needed to move forward. In Part 4, everything comes together: the conflict between family love and state responsibility, the long-term implications for the trio, and why, in the eyes of investigators, the most compassionate decision was also the most controversial. Comment below. After seeing their progress, do you believe supervised visits were the right middle ground? As months passed, the picture grew clearer, not just for the state, but for anyone who bothered to look past the emotions and into the evidence. The idea that Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were taken from their home by force or cruelty was a myth pushed by outside voices who understood neither the family's needs nor their reality. What truly happened was far more complex, far more painful, and far more justified than many wanted to admit. Every professional involved in the case reached the same conclusion: the trio was safer, healthier, and more stable in structured care than they had been in years. This didn't invalidate the decades Larry and Betty spent caring for them. It didn't erase the sacrifices they made or the love they gave. But it did reveal something essential, something too many families face as they age. There comes a point when love can no longer compete with physical decline, overwhelming responsibility, and environments that spiral beyond control. For the Whittaker household, that point had arrived long before the state intervened. Chaos had become normal. Neglect had become invisible. Danger had become familiar. And the trio, unable to speak up or advocate for themselves, absorbed the consequences in silence. The irony is that the online world kept demanding a reunification, insisting the family must be put back together exactly as things were before. But that romantic version of the story collapses under the weight of what investigators saw. They found a home without stability. They found caregivers collapsing under exhaustion. They found abusers allowed back through the door. They found medical needs ignored out of necessity, not malice. They found 3 vulnerable adults aging without the protection the law promises them. No one wanted to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. Returning them home would mean returning them to danger. Even supervised visitation proved that point. When visits happened in a controlled environment, with no intoxicated visitors, no fights, no unexpected intrusions, the interactions were peaceful. The family smiled. They connected. They cared for one another. But the moment supervision ended, the state had to consider what happened next. Outside of that controlled room, the same variables would reappear: unpredictable people, unsafe conditions, money issues, and the overwhelming burden on elderly caregivers. It wasn't the love that failed. It was the environment that failed. It was the capacity that failed. It was the ability to protect that collapsed under the weight of reality. By the time court hearings concluded, the state's position had hardened, not out of cruelty, but out of responsibility. They determined that the trio would remain in long-term care permanently. Not because the family didn't want them, but because the family could no longer safely meet their needs. This was not a punishment. This was not an attack. This was not the state stealing anyone. It was protection, something Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy had needed for years without anyone willing or able to say the words out loud. The final decision reflected something larger than this one family. It reflected a universal truth about caretaking, poverty, disability, and aging. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones least equipped to keep you alive. In their new placements, the trio experienced stability, true stability, for the first time. Clean beds, regular meals, medical monitoring, safe surroundings, controlled access, predictable routines, dignity. These were not luxuries. They were human rights the trio had quietly lived without for years. And the most striking observation came from the people who saw them every day after the removal. They were calmer. They were healthier. They were safer. They were living, not surviving. The hardest truth, the one that breaks hearts even while it heals lives, is this. Sometimes the safest place is not home. Sometimes the most loving choice is the most painful one. Sometimes protecting vulnerable adults means removing them from the very people who raised them. Not because those people don't care, but because caring is no longer enough. In the end, the state didn't take them away to punish a family. They took them because